The crisis nobody was ready to name. At first, it didn't feel like a crisis at all. There were no crashing markets, no collapsing banks, no headlines screaming disaster. Everything looked stable, almost too stable. And that was the problem no one knew how to describe. To understand why this moment matters, we have to go back to a period when traditional warning signs stopped appearing. Volatility stayed low. Losses were contained. Interventions worked. By every visible metric, the system appeared healthy. Yet beneath that calm, pressure was accumulating in unfamiliar ways. The absence of distress signals did not indicate the absence of distress. It indicated that the channels through which distress normally communicated had been muted by the very mechanisms designed to maintain order. This crisis did not arrive through failure. It arrived through distortion. Risk was building, but not where models looked. Imbalances were forming, but not where regulators focused. The system was changing shape faster than the language used to describe it. The conceptual tools available for identifying danger were calibrated for a previous generation of threats, and the new threats were emerging domains that those tools were not designed to detect. Early observers struggled to explain what felt wrong. Markets were functioning. Institutions were profitable. Consumers were spending, but incentives were quietly misaligning. Behavior was adapting to protection rather than fundamentals. Stability was present, but it felt conditional, dependent on constant management. The dependence on management was itself the signal, but recognizing management-dependent stability as a warning rather than an achievement required a framework that did not yet exist. The reveal began with a contradiction. The safer the system appeared, the harder it became to justify caution. Warnings sounded abstract. Concern felt unnecessary. After all, nothing was visibly breaking, and without visible failure, there was no clear authority to declare a crisis. This was a danger. Crises are usually named after damage appears, but this one was taking shape before damage, inside assumptions rather than balance sheets. It lived in expectations, dependencies, and delayed reactions. The system was not failing. It was drifting. And drift is far harder to confront than collapse, because collapse demands response. Drift demands recognition, and recognition was still missing. As the drift continued, behavior across the system began to reflect it. Decisions were made with increasing confidence that stability would persist. Risk was not eliminated, it was relocated, pushed into corners less visible, less regulated, and harder to measure. The migration of risk from visible to invisible locations was not a failure of the system. It was a rational response to a regulatory environment that scrutinized visible risk and ignored risk that manifested in unfamiliar forms. Financial models struggled to keep up. Built on historical patterns, they signaled calm even as conditions diverged from the past. Stress tests passed comfortably. Loss scenarios looked manageable. The system appeared prepared for crises that resembled previous ones, but blind to new forms taking shape. The model's reliance on historical data meant that they could only identify risks that had been observed before. Novel risks, the kind that emerged from structural changes in the system, were invisible to backward-looking analysis. Institutions adjusted in response to this perceived safety. Leverage crept higher where it seemed justified. Liquidity depended more heavily on continuous confidence. Short-term funding became routine. These shifts felt rational, even prudent, given the absence of visible stress. Meanwhile, warning signals grew quieter. Volatility remained suppressed. Corrections were shallow. Small disruptions were absorbed quickly through intervention. Each success reinforced the belief that the system had learned how to avoid real crises altogether. This was the reveal deepening. The system had not become safer in every dimension. It had become better at postponing visible consequences. Risk accumulated silently, shielded by mechanisms designed to prevent panic. Stability had become a curtain, not a mirror. The distinction is essential. A mirror reflects conditions as they are. A curtain conceals conditions behind an appearance of calm. The system's stability was increasingly of the curtain variety, offering reassurance while obscuring the accumulation of pressure behind it. The early conflict sharpened as incentives diverged. Those who questioned the calm appeared out of step with reality. Raising concern carried reputational cost. Without a clear trigger, Caution felt unjustified. Drift continued because nothing forced it to stop. The crisis nobody was ready to name was not defined by collapse. It was defined by comfort. Comfort that dulled sensitivity. Comfort that delayed adjustment. Comfort that hid imbalance. And the longer that comfort lasted, the harder recognition would become. The tension reached its peak when small shocks began producing outsized confusion. Not panic, not collapse, but hesitation. Events that should have been easily interpreted suddenly felt ambiguous. Markets paused instead of reacting. Institutions waited instead of adjusting. The system was no longer sure how to read its own signals. This was the emotional core of the unnamed crisis. Stability had muted feedback for so long that interpretation itself became difficult. Volatility, once a warning system, had been suppressed into irrelevance. When movement finally appeared, no one knew whether it mattered. Decision-makers face an unfamiliar problem. Acting too early risked overreaction. Acting too late risked exposure. Without clear indicators, timing became guesswork. The system had lost its internal compass, relying instead on expectation of guidance rather than evidence of imbalance. Behavior synchronized around waiting. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for response. Waiting for someone else to define the moment. And as waiting spread, pressure concentrated. Risk that might have been released gradually began stacking up behind hesitation. This was a conflict in full view. The system had optimized for calm, but in doing so, it had weakened its ability to self-correct. Adaptation slowed. Adjustment was deferred. Stability, once a signal of health, now obscured stress. Internally, unease grew. Metrics still looked strong, but confidence in those metrics faded. The models were speaking, but no one trusted what they were saying. The crisis had not arrived with force. It had arrived with uncertainty. And uncertainty unmanaged is its own form of danger. The buildup had reached its limit. Either the system would rediscover its ability to respond without instruction, or the drift would continue until reaction was no longer optional. And history suggests drift rarely stops on its own. The resolution did not come from a single announcement or dramatic intervention. It came from acknowledgement, a gradual recognition that the absence of volatility was no longer a sign of strength, but a signal that information was being suppressed. The climax emerged when leaders accepted an uncomfortable truth. The system had become too dependent on managed calm. It needed to relearn how to process stress in real time, even when that stress felt politically or economically inconvenient. Stability had to give way to signal. Slowly, space was allowed for adjustment. Not collapse, but correction. Markets were permitted to move. Prices were allowed to reflect uncertainty. Discomfort returned, not as chaos, but as communication. The system began speaking to itself again. The resolution reshaped priorities. Risk was no longer treated solely as something to smooth away. It was treated as data. Volatility regained its role as feedback rather than failure. Institutions adjusted models to capture behavior, not just history. Oversight shifted from suppressing movement to understanding it. What endured was a vital lesson. Crises do not always arrive as explosions. Some arrive as silence. And when silence replaces feedback, danger grows unnoticed. The crisis nobody was ready to name was not a breakdown of infrastructure. It was a breakdown of interpretation. And once that was recognized, the system could begin learning again. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The